Okay, welcome everybody. We're here for the J. Anthony Lukas Prize Project ceremony. We'll be honoring excellence in nonfiction book writing with 4 awards. I'm Nick Lemon. I'm ex-dean, now faculty member here at Columbia Journalism School. And I'm especially happy to be here because I was back in 1997, I guess, 25 years ago, part of the founding crew that set up this program. Tony Lukas was a wonderful nonfiction writer and reporter who was not only great at what he did, but also cared a lot about the field. This kind of work is not part of mass culture, shall we say, but it's a distinct community of people who really care about it and are devoted to it and help and support each other. And it was very important to Tony to be part of that community. He put on, with me as his sort of deputy, a big conference on nonfiction writing at the New York State Writers Institute in Albany back in 91 or 92 called Telling the Truth. At the time of his death, he was the president of the Authors Guild. He just, did as much as he could possibly do, not just for his own work, but for other people who do this work. And I think he would be really pleased to see what this program named after him has become. I never got to know Mark Linton because he had died, I think, by the time we started this program. I got to know his widow and his children who are here very well. And I gather he was an equally remarkable man, but I can't sort of tell you about it from experience. And he had a passion for historical writing, especially historical writing that's done for people who are historians and people who aren't historians too, which does not describe all historical writing. And it was just a wonderful coming together to have the mourning Lukas family and the mourning Linton family find each other at a moment in the late 1990s and come together and build this program together. It's really been a wonderful experience for everybody and produced a bunch of great events and winners. Our partner in this is the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. This event is held alternate years, I guess in even-numbered years. It's here, and in odd-numbered years, it's in Cambridge at the Nieman Foundation. Our partner in running this, Anne-Marie Lipinski, who's the head of the Nieman Foundation, couldn't be here tonight, but I want to thank her and everyone there for the role they have in this program. So I want to just set up the awarding of the awards, and then we'll have a discussion. I should say 2 other things about this particular prize program. One, we are somewhat distinctive among journalism awards in that we're not just operating after the fact. It was very important to Tony and to all of us who work on this to understand, this wouldn't apply to anybody in this room, but sometimes it can be hard to get a book written, and sometimes you run out of money, and so a little cash and validation and community can be a big help, and it's this that describes our Work in Progress Award, which is a particularly distinctive feature of the Lukas prizes. And the other thing is, as seen in the event we put on back in '91, Tony really liked to have a conversation among nonfiction writers. We're all nonfiction writers, so we can let our hair down a little bit, and I don't think I'm the only one who sometimes feels like fiction writers get to be like real writers with a capital W, and nonfiction writers are subject matter experts. What should be our policy on this? And that's not how we think of ourselves, And so it was important to Tony to create a sort of space where we could talk about what it's really like to do this work, and we'll do that after we confer the awards. First, I want to thank the judges of these awards. They do, as my kids would say, a shit ton of work, because these are not always short books. And it's wonderful that they spend the time to do this out of devotion to nonfiction. The judges who are here, I believe, and forgive me if I've left you out, are Rachel Louise Snyder, Anthony De Palma, and Julia Pastor. So can you stand up and take a bow? Thanks to the board of the Lukas Prizes, and again, these are the ones I think are here, and if I've left you out, I'm sorry, and I'll ask you collectively to stand up and take a bow also. Jonathan Alter, Shay Earhart, Sam Friedman, and Pamela Paul. We have last year's Mark Linton History Prize winner here with us, William Thomas. Can you stand up and... And we have Michael Linton and Lily Linton here. Can you all? We did, but they're gone. Okay, well, they were here, and we applaud them in their very recent absence, and the whole family for their ongoing and general support for making these awards possible. We're grateful for their support of the awards and for the research grants they give to students in Sam Friedman's book writing class every year. I think we have some students here this year, but I don't know for sure, but if so, welcome. And now we'll give out the awards. Abby, come on up. This is Abby Wright, who runs most of the prizes here at the school, and she'll give me a hand presenting the awards. Okay. The J. Anthony Lukas Book Prize is presented to a book-length work of narrative nonfiction on a topic of American social or political concern that exemplifies the literary grace, commitment to serious research, and original reporting that characterized the distinguished work of the award's namesake. The prize carries a $10,000 honorarium. This year's judges, Bruce Tracy, the chair, Jess Bruder, Julia Pastor, and Thomas Chatterton Williams. This year's winner is author and journalist Andrea Elliott for her book, Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. Andrea is an investigative reporter for the New York Times and the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize, a George Polk Award, an Overseas Press Club Award, and other honors. Most importantly, she's a graduate of Columbia Journalism School. The judge's citation reads, Invisible Child is a tour de force of immersive reporting and meticulous and unflinching depiction of intergenerational American poverty. Andrea Elliott spent 8 years following her subject, 11-year-old Dasani, and her parents and 7 siblings in and out of New York City homeless shelters, courts, schools, welfare offices, and ultimately the Pennsylvania boarding school that offers the first chance of hope. Exemplifying the best of the Lukas tradition, Elliott exposes the granular texture of daily life with deep empathy, the punishing sameness of material want, and in the process paints a sweeping portrait of contemporary American life, still marked by prejudices and injustices set in motion in the past. As the number of homeless Americans continues to rise, this is a book that demands and deserves our attention. Congratulations, Andrea. Others will join you in a minute. This year's for the J. Anthony Lukas Book Prize is awarded to journalist and author Patrick Radden Keefe for Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. Patrick is an author and a staff writer at The New Yorker. The judges write in their citation that Empire of Pain is a revelatory look inside the rise of one of the most powerful and ruthless dynasties in America, whose indifference toward the consequences of their actions is enabled by the astronomical wealth and privilege that shield them. With reporting and research of impressive depth and breadth, Patrick Radden Keefe weaves a wealth of facts, figures, depositions, first-hand interviews, and original documents into a harrowing and heartbreaking reading experience. Empire of Pain is a searing portrait of a massive public health crisis, one of the most devastating in recent memory, as well as the ambition, greed, and insularity of the family at its center. Patrick couldn't be here with us tonight, but we salute him. So. The Mark Linton History Prize is awarded annually to a work of history on any subject that best combines intellectual distinction with felicity of expression and carries a $10,000 honorarium. This year's judges were Julia Keller, Anthony De Palma, and Kerry Greenridge. This year's winner is author Jane Rogoyska for Surviving Katyn, Stalin's Polish Massacre and the Search for Truth. Jane is a British author and filmmaker of Polish origin and is also the author of Gerda Taro, Inventing Robert Capa, with a particular interest in the turbulent period from the 1930s to the Cold War in Europe. The judges write in their citation, to the chilly and brutal abstraction of the phrase mass grave, Surviving Katyn provides an eloquent and crucial clarification. They were individuals, those 22,000 Polish prisoners of war secretly murdered during World War II and buried in a Polish forest. For decades, the crime was blamed on the Nazis. As Rogoyska traces with a quietly masterful breadth of detail, however, evidence now proves that Stalin personally ordered the massacre. Thus, her book is part detective story, part historical narrative, part biography of the victims, and part moral reckoning, with urgent relevance to contemporary conflicts. Congratulations, Jane. Come on up. This year's finalist for the Mark Linton History Prize is Katie Booth's The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power, and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness. Katie teaches writing at the University of Pittsburgh and was raised in a mixed hearing and deaf family. This is her first book. The judge's citation reads, a complex and profoundly moving historical saga, The Invention of Miracles is an insightful portrait of the extraordinary life of Alexander Graham Bell, as well as a retelling of his decades-long crusade to teach the deaf to speak with their lips and not their hands. Relying on Bell's own papers and those of his contemporaries, as well as diving deeply into the archives of the deaf community, Booth focuses on the cultural impact of Bell's work with the deaf without shying away from the more controversial aspects of his mission, bypassing sign language, interpreting deaf genealogy, and flirting with the now discredited science of eugenics before distancing himself from its most radical ideas. Superbly written and decidedly subjective, The Invention of Miracles provides a challenging portrait of an imperfect genius. Katie could not be with us tonight. Finally, the two J. Anthony Lukas Work in Progress Awards in the amount of $25,000 given annually to aid the completion of significant works of nonfiction and on a topic of American political or social concern. This year's judges were Rachel Louise Snyder, the chair, Paul Golub, and David Troyer. Roxana Asgharian wins the first award for We Were Once a Family, the Heart, Murder, Suicide, and the System Failing Our Kids. She is an independent investigative journalist focused on child protection and criminal legal systems, and a native of Las Vegas. The judge's citation reads, "Tracing the devastating story of the Hart family's shocking murder-suicide after the children's adoptive mothers drove the entire family off a California cliff, Asgharian paints a moving portrait of lost lives and failed systems. With an ever-present lens on poverty and racism, Asgharian's investigation illuminates the innumerable ways child welfare agencies failed these 6 young black children, and indicts the ways the most vulnerable among us are imperiled by the very systems created to protect them." Congratulations, Roxana. Okay. The second Work in Progress Award goes to Mei Jiang for The Life, Sex, Work, and Love in America. Mei is a reporter at Vanity Fair. Her reporting from Afghanistan has received the South Asian Journalist Association's Daniel Pearl Award. Judge's citation: "Carefully piecing together the vast mosaic of forces that often compel sex work in America today, poverty, neglect, racism, addiction, discrimination, Jiang dissects the ways in which women are punished disproportionately for the actions of men. Her tireless reporting on the chaotic and haphazard world of domestic sex trafficking grapples with the very idea of how we think about sex workers today, including not only the stigma around them, but also the very idea of what it means culturally, criminally, and sociologically to rescue someone." Congratulations, Mei. Okay, now it's time for our panel discussion, which will be led by Pamela Paul, who's a member of the Lukas board. So I'm going to leave the stage, and she's going to come up. Pamela, until very recently, like about a week ago or something, was the editor of the New York Times Book Review, which she'd done for 9 years. Is that right? And she oversaw all book coverage at the Times. A former arts correspondent for The Economist, Pamela joined the Times in 2011 as the children's books editor and is the author of 8 books. Now she's just starting a career as a Times opinion columnist. I believe 2 columns so far. So she's off to a flying start. And come on up, and don't go here, go there, and I'll go down and listen to you. Thanks, everybody.
Two quick things before we start. One, I'm not actually going to be checking my phone, but I am being texted your questions on my phone, so that is why I'm holding this. I'm not distracted. And the second thing I just want to say, now that I'm allowed to have public opinions, that it is my opinion that it is really good and right that we take a moment to note that there are 4 women winners up here. It was, when I joined the book review only 11 years ago, there was still this sort of background debate of like women writing serious nonfiction. So now it just feels natural and good and just. So congratulations to everyone here. I just want to start off by asking a really basic question of each of you. And I'm going to start, I'm not going to go down in order. I'm going to start with the 2 who have written their books, just to make it a little bit easier on those who are not quite done, to tell us about the origin story of your book and project. Because, Andrea, I know you started this when you were at the Times. It started from your journalism.
Yes. So first of all, I want to just say I'm so incredibly honored to receive this award, and Lukas is a hero, and I am sitting in this room with mentors of mine in this room, including Sam Friedman, whose book class I would like to think really planted the seed of this, if we're talking about origins, many, many years ago. And my daughter's here, and my agent Tina, and I just owe them so much. She's telling me to speak up. Okay. Thank you for that. So, you know, well, what I would say about it to kind of summarize it is that I have always been drawn to, you know, human existence and to the narratives of people more than anything else. And I had been doing that for a really long time when I found my way into this story but in a very ironic manner, which was a statistic, is what did it. I saw 1 in 5 children were growing up poor in America. I thought that was strange and kind of outrageous. I called colleagues, started, you know, working the phones to kind of figure out why this wasn't a bigger story. And in a way, it wasn't a bigger story because, and that's part of the reason it was such a big story, is that it is a stubborn problem and it wasn't going away. And we were coming upon half a century after LBJ's declared war on poverty, and some gains had happened, but a lot remained to be done. And so just from that kind of like many, many thousands of feet above the ground jump out of the sky, I wound up landing finally in the life of Dasani after a long, long search. And by the time I met her, my typical reporter checklist had kind of gone out the window. I had this checklist that was based on a certain demographic profile that meant it was a smaller family, that maybe she was part Latina, I am Latina, it would have been easier, I would have been able to speak Spanish with her parents. All of those things just wound up being kind of background noise, because when I met her, she just grabbed my heart, and I felt electrified around her and her family. I felt like these were people whose lives I wanted to know. And then, you know, what I find usually is that if that's the case for me, it's going to be the case for the reader. And so that was how it all began. But I never thought I would have spent as much time as I wound up spending with them.
Well, speaking of time, just quickly, how long did you spend reporting this series that appeared in the paper? And at what point did you say to yourself, there's more and there's a book here and I want to do that?
So I really think that writing a book is a little bit, I'm just going to say it, it's a little bit like getting married. You know, you have to be very, very much in love because you know it's going to be really hard. And I hadn't fallen in love until then with a story this way. I didn't decide to write a book. I think it just kind of chose me. I don't even remember when the moment was, but I do remember picking up the phone and calling Tina and saying, will you be my agent? Because this series is running in the paper. Literally, it was day 2 of the series and my phone's ringing off the hook and I think I have a book. And you said, sure. And it quickly became a book. But it was in my mind, I think, as a book long before that moment. And I think it took possession of me, you know. It's a story that just took possession of me and kept showing me everything I didn't know and I thought I knew. The city I thought I knew, but here it really is. Look at this. The history I thought I knew, no, go deeper. And at every turn I felt like it was an education in so many new and important issues. And so that's why it took as long as it did, because I felt I owed it to the story to go as deep as I did.
And Jane, for you, I'm assuming you went into this knowing this was going to be a book, but what was the origin of the project?
I really recognise that thing about being possessed by an idea, because I've lived with this subject for several years now. I think the seed was originally planted. I don't know if anybody remembers, in 2010, there was a terrible air crash, the Smolensk air crash, which was when the Polish president, along with many dignitaries, was on his way, in fact, to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the 1940 Katyn massacre. And the plane crashed just outside Smolensk, setting off a series of echoes of the original event, which were very powerful. And it was at that moment, I think, that the seed was planted, because I realized that none of my British friends knew what Catin was and had never heard of it. And I started thinking about it, and I wrote another book, and I went away from it. And then when I was thinking about writing a new book, it took hold of me and actually almost has yet to release me. I'm still slightly living with the legacy of it. But yes, it's taken up quite a lot of space in my head for a long time, and taken me on a very long journey of research, not with living people, but with dead people. But actually, in a way, part of my motivation was an act of resurrection, because the victims of 22,000 Polish prisoners of war who died in this massacre, of whom just under 400 survived, tend to be treated as sort of faceless martyrs. They're only associated as victims of this massacre, and I really felt I wanted to bring them back as human beings with all their faults and all their individual personalities, and that was the kind of initial motivation, and it sprawled from there.
So given that there was low awareness of this event in the UK, did you have to do a lot of persuading to say, like, this deserves to be investigated, this should be a book?
Well, interestingly, so I was in the process of changing agent, in fact, and I wrote to an agent who I was interested in representing me, and I sent him something else. And then I did that thing that writers do. I don't know if it's just me. You go, I've got this idea. And then at the end you say, and I've got a couple of other ideas. And Catin was this little thing at the end. And he emailed back and said, I'm not interested in the first one, but I'd really like to see a book about Catin. So he was very much behind it. And One World, who's a smaller publisher, got behind it. And that's how it happened. So actually, I personally didn't have to do a lot of persuading, but I think perhaps he did. Yeah.
So for Roxana, you started off as Andrea did, reporting this. And when did you decide this should be a book and this is what I want to do? It was a widely reported story at the time.
Yes. So I live in Texas, and the way I got a hold of this story at first was that it was a breaking news assignment from the Oregonian in Portland, and I went to find the birth family of 3 of the kids that were involved in the crash, and that was a tip that I got from a friend of ours who lives in Portland, and so I went in there on like a day 1, day 2 story, and I was the only reporter around. So typically I've done breaking news in New York, and you're with a scrum of people and everyone's kind of, so I was sort of expecting that. It wasn't like that at all. I was invited into their home, and I immediately, I was pretty overwhelmed with the grief that they were experiencing, because I had just heard the news of their children who had been removed from their care a decade prior. That they had just heard that they had been murdered. So I had actually written a story about foster care in 2016 or something, and so when I was hearing what was going on, I was like, this is a foster care story, this is a child welfare story, and like you said, it was a pretty big national story at the time, and it felt like there was this cognitive dissonance between what I was experiencing with the birth families and then what was being reported, which was very focused on the women, very focused on like the psychological motivations. It was very true crimey, and I felt like there was a equally, if not more important narrative about the systems in place that allowed it and sort of enabled it to happen that was not getting looked at. And then also there was just this extreme emotional element of this family's grief that felt it bowled me over. And I felt like I did a couple breaking news stories, then I did a deeper story, and then I did a story on the other birth family. And I was like, this isn't done for me. I don't feel finished with it, And so that's sort of how I said, I think this is all kind of one larger story, and it needs to be told together.
And not quite yet finished with it, but hopefully will soon be. May, our other work in progress winner, how did you decide to write a book on this subject? How did the idea come to you?
I was just thinking that there's probably should actually be called the Not Quite Finished Yet award, which I'm very grateful to have won. I have many origin stories, but I think the most succinct one is that I'm a magazine writer, and normally after I finish a story, I never want to talk about that subject ever again. And I had done a few stories about sex work and sex trafficking and these prostitution raids in 2018 and 19, and I still had a lot of questions left, which is always a good sign. And I figured I work for myself, and I figured I could afford to take maybe 2 months off to look into the subject to see if there's anything there. And at the end of this 2 months that I'd allotted myself, I had nothing. I was very confused. And I actually, I went up to Susie's house upstate, and I gave myself a week. I'm going to cobble together some kind of a proposal or something. And instead I spent the week going on hikes and reading plays, and I did nothing. And I came home in distress thinking, I've wasted 60 days, but what is 60 days? And I'm going through my mail, and there's a letter from a women's prison facility. And I think reporters do get mail from prison, and usually it's like, I'm a serial killer, do you want to be a pen pal? And so that's usually the case. But in this instance, it was this 8-page letter, neat handwriting, and it was a woman who had read an article I'd written in Vanity Fair magazine about a prostitution raid. And the only reason why she'd subscribe to VF was because of the perfume inserts. That's the only reason why she wanted to, get this magazine. And she normally never reads articles, but it caught her eye because it was about, I'm telling the story in a terrible way. She was in prison for sex trafficking a minor, which sounds terrible, but as is often the case when you sort of peel back the layers, that's not quite as it seems. And that was the beginning of it.
I'm going to ask a question that I think we often ask at this event. The first time I came to the Lukas Prize ceremony, Bob Caro was one of the winners, and someone asked him about his process, and this is where I first learned that he would get dressed and put on a suit and a tie and go to his office, and I always thought I don't know, it felt like something to aspire to, oddly. But so here's the process question for all of you, and May, I'll actually just start with you again. What is your writing process like? Where do you write? How do you work? Do you use old-timey things like paper products and pens, or what do you do?
Scrivener. I use Scrivener. So I read everything. I talk to everyone, just download everything, watch all the things, and then everything gets dumped into Scrivener. And then I create an Word document of everything I want in there. And then I just move it around until it makes sense, and that's it. That's what I do.
Everyone can name their favorite app. And in terms of also when do you get up and work? What's your day like?
Really?
Yeah, we're going to be nosy here.
I obviously lead the most virtuous life. I rise with the sun. I don't know. Have a complete breakfast, do yoga for 4 hours.
Jane, do you get dressed in your suit and tie?
If only. I love this question, I have to say. I've just today, I'm lucky enough to be in New York for a few days. I live in London. I just found a stationery shop in somewhere in Greenwich Village. What was it called? I can't remember, but I'm obsessed with stationery. Not that it plays a part in my process. It does a little bit. I start in the morning. I go to work. I go to work upstairs in my house. I start at 9:30, whatever. I work with Scrivener, which is a very useful app. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very useful app for writers, particularly if you've got a lot of material coming from different sources. I find it really helpful for kind of looking at things in a non-linear way. I have to have a coffee. There's a symbolic coffee that it makes I think when you work from home, and if you have a family as well, it's very important to make a dividing line between your work existence and your family existence. And I shut my door, I have my coffee, and then supposedly I start work. But you show up, you do the work, You do it every day, and you don't wait for inspiration. I've learned this through bitter experience. You don't wait for the inspiration. You just get on with it. And I will work all morning, and depending there are different I'm sure everyone else will appreciate, there are very different stages to writing. Researching, I could do that all day, quite happily. I could just research, go to an archive, sit on internet journeys, disappear down a tunnel. Wonderful. Starting to write is like pulling teeth. It's awful, and I would do almost anything to avoid it. And it's sort of physically really difficult. Once you've written a baggy, horrible first draft, rough draft, and then you're rewriting, redrafting, endless, version 1.13 something, whatever, endless, then that becomes equally obsessive and can take up many hours. But that's my process.
Well, since you obviously like research and this is a work of history, did the fact that you had to go deep into the historical record present challenges? Do you, in terms of language, in terms of accessibility of sources?
It's a very interesting one, that actually, because the nature of the subject, so the Katyn massacre, because it was covered up for over 4 decades in Eastern Europe, in the West, there was a lot of information about it. So actually, most of the information pre the collapse of communism, pre-1990, is in London, which is where the Polish government in exile was based, and the Sikorski Institute there holds enormous quantities of material, as does the British Library. It has an extraordinary Polish connection. So I had to do the research in a mixture of English and Polish. Polish, I'm half Polish, but I was not brought up speaking Polish, and I've learned it as an adult, and I still find it hard work. Everything post-1990 comes out of Poland or Russia, and so I had to go to Warsaw to research in archives there. I mean, there's an awful lot that you can get through the internet nowadays, but I wanted to find fresh research, so I went back to primary sources in Poland. So it was a kind of two-pronged thing, but actually an enormous chunk of the first part of the research was done in London.
And the material from Russia, this is all open now? You can get to it?
Well, so the material about Katyn was opened in the 1990s and has all been translated into Polish. I don't speak Russian, so I read it all in Polish. A lot of it, again, amazingly, how we love our libraries. The British Library has astonishing quantities of it. I only had to go to Poland for very obscure things that hadn't found its way into publication. Yeah.
Roxanne, I'm going to skip to you because I just want to say that if you're not using Scrivener, clearly this is what will get you over the finish line. What is your working process like, writing and research and reporting?
So I got the book deal 2 weeks before lockdown, and that was, so the idea that I had in my head about the process of writing the book was very much not the way that it actually went. I ended up so I have a 5-year-old, and we were all at home for a good 1.5 years. So I ended up doing these writing trips to the hill country. I live in Houston, and so I would go to these sort of guest houses on the ranch with the cows and the goats and stuff. And it was, I would report for like a month on whatever chapter I was going to be working on. And then I would go and just bang it out in 4 days, usually. And that was a really, I did it because I just literally couldn't get the brain space that I needed to do the deep writing with my kiddo at home. But then I kind of just love it. It ended up being really, because you could just work all day, you could work 10 hours, and you can make yourself like an egg and then not talk to anyone. So I feel like maybe now I have spoiled myself for future writing projects, because it is very nice to write totally alone.
Andrea, what was it like for you? What was your process?
So, as the mom of 2 children, single mom, but with a devoted co-parent, so I had stretches of time where I could devote to myself entirely to the writing. I very much relate to what you just said, and I feel about time a certain almost kind of greed. Like I jealously guard it when I have it. definitely I'm waking up at 5 a.m. and going around the clock and, of just obsessively trying to squeeze everything I can out of that solitude, because interruption for me is the enemy of the process. And children, as we know, we love them so much, they interrupt. So when I had my kids, I woke up very early. Usually I tried to crank out 2 hours of work before they woke up, and they tended to wake up because they've grown up with this book. So Ava was 3 when I started. She's 13 now. And that got me into this rhythm of waking up really early in this discipline. But I will also say, and I loved what you said.
It is very early.
4.
Wow. Okay, I just have to ask
But when you have kids, I mean, for me, I could never sleep past 6 after having kids. I just rewired my brain forever. I'm not pretending, I could be hungover, and it doesn't matter. At 6 o'clock, I'm wide awake. It's terrible, but it just is what it is. But I loved hearing you also speak about your process, because I actually think of myself not as a writer, but as a rewriter. I think that the first words you put on the page, they're just an invitation to kind of really start, right? And there's so much. It's not one process, and it's also not even in the same day is it one process. So in terms of carving out time, my project was very much a balancing act, if you could call it that, a straddling of real-time events that I didn't have any control over, constantly happening, that I had to stay on top of, and which is a deep immersion of reporting and then a deep immersion of writing, and they were sometimes in battle, right? And I had to learn to toggle between them, and so. And then we can, I have a very, from the outside, it looks like an extremely, very, very organized process, almost to the point of OCD. But when you go a little bit, scratch beneath the surface, you see that it's a complete mess. So I was always looking for things or trying to figure out where in the piles. But I did have a lot of systems in place. And I think, I also depend a lot on different mediums. I don't trust my memory, and so I work a lot with video and audio, and the people I wrote about would share those things with me as well. They would take video if I wasn't there, and so that helped to bring the writing alive if I hadn't been around in a while. But I think, like, going back to process, there's a morning brain and there's an afternoon brain. I don't like my afternoon brain. I like my early morning, and my late evening brain, and everything else is fine. But basically, just learn yourself.
Period.
Afternoon. Yeah. So there's a lot to say about process. It's a great question.
Well, another process-related question then for you, because you were writing about a very real person, Dasani, and her family, and they are continuing to live, and their lives are going on, and your story is continuing. And at what point did you say, okay, I need to stop here? This is where this story ends in terms of the book, and I need to write and stop the reporting.
I can tell you very specifically that it happened on 3 occasions, and all 3 endings are in the book. I thought the book ended 3 times.
Lord of the Rings. Sorry.
Well, I don't know. Is it? Yes, maybe. I think I knew. Finally, when I witnessed the final scene that is the end, I felt this kind of just whole body, like, okay, it's over, stop. But the relationship with the material, with the people, it doesn't end. It stays inside. I feel like I have inhabited this story for the rest of my life in a way. And I mean, of course, it's different once you've released it into the world as a book. For one thing, you get to enjoy the responses of other people. I mean, it's so extraordinary to me that I get to engage with people who are like, and then when Chanel said this, and Supreme, these are people who I was on a first name basis with and inside their lives for years, and suddenly they feel that intimately a part of the life of the reader is such, it's a revelation. But yeah, I'll stop there.
I want to stay with both of you for a minute because you both were writing with children, but you're writing about children, and you're both writing about at-risk children, and balancing those very human stories with these larger systemic issues. And I'm interested in getting a sense of how you decide to balance those two big subjects, two very different kinds of storytelling in your work. And Roxana, we'll start with you. Because it's all done. Almost.
Yeah, well, I'm getting there. That's a really good question. I think that my brain thinks of things in a systemic way, possibly. So as I said, when I met the birth family, at first I said, okay, this is definitely a child welfare story. And I had learned some reporting skills of how to access information related to child welfare stories, which, information can be really hard to come by because almost everything is confidential as it relates to specific cases. So that's like a little puzzle for me. And I got, that's sort of the easy part in a way. The hardest part for me was the emotional intensity of the work and the witnessing of the grief and the feelings, which was like I felt I would tell my friends I had sort of had a part-time job of like figuring out how to deal with this kind of work. So for me, like the individual stories are very clear because the emotional beats of the stories and of my sources' experiences felt very intuitive. But it was a lot more difficult to do that work than to do the kind of systemic reporting, which you can get angry when you're looking at systems that aren't operating well, and that's sustaining. The digging and the getting mad, like that's very sustaining, and it's a different aspect to go into the sort of emotional, to really sit and witness and process people's real grief.
May, I'm going to turn to you because you're also talking about a lot of dysfunctional systems and larger issues, and your book explores so many different layers, from race to immigration to our attitudes around sex and violence in the sex trade. Can you talk a little bit about how you sort of balance and see those different issues working into your book?
All the things that you just mentioned. That's why I love the subject. It's at the intersection of so many of my interests, as well as topics that we're having national reckonings around. And I think that's also the challenge of the project as well. I feel like, my organizational philosophy is probably something closer to like chaotic evil. It's just, there's a lot going on and they overlap, and I go down these like rabbit holes, and occasionally someone sort of pulls me out. But yeah, what I find super compelling about sex work is that it's not just about sex work, queer sex work, but it's also happens to be about like gender, race, and class. And one of the more like a theme that I'm exploring in one of the sections is this idea of this has been, I think, discussed quite a bit now, but the fact that like anti-prostitution legislation often effectively functions as anti-immigration legislation, anti-trans legislation, and they're often like anti-women and anti-poor people, and so just the ways in which it intersects, I find quite interesting. That's obviously, it was also, I think, upsettingly on very prominent display during the shootings down in Atlanta, where a bunch of massage parlors were shot up. It was really interesting in the early sort of hours of following that event. There was a lot of need to, and I do think this is, I don't know if it's like an enlightenment need to categorize or it's just a human thing, but there's a lot of desire to figure out, no, they were sex workers, no, they died because they're Asian, and surprise, it could be all of the above, unfortunately.
You also write that people can be prostitutes and victims both. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. That was a revelation that came to me, I think, in some ways by way of my time in Afghanistan. I used to live there. That's where I began my career. And what I was quite struck by was that, in a place like Afghanistan, it really matters if you are a civilian or a fighting age male or some other category, that you can live and die by them. And that was one of my like big lessons from that place. And then I come to America and I realized that our society is structured not much differently. And so the problem with the ways in which sex trafficking and sex work is adjudicated within our legal system is that it really incentivizes people to self-identify as victims. This is the only way in which you can get your sentence commuted or not go to prison at all, or what have you. And that is what is fueling a rhetoric, a particular kind of rhetoric about trafficking being this like big menace as well. If you identify yourself as a victim, DAs actually, so the Manhattan DA recently, that office recently came out saying we're not going to prosecute women. Oddly enough, the other boroughs are not following suit. But if you talk to the DAs in that office, what's quite interesting is that they call it the bottom problem. And what they mean by that is that often within the hierarchy of being a pimp or a madam or what have you, you have the pimp, and then the second in line is colloquially called the bottom, and it's often a woman, and it's often the bottom who ends up going to prison because she is often the one who's grooming, she's recruiting, she's out there doing the work of the pimp. And so in this instance, the bottom becomes a perpetrator, but so often she's also a victim as well. And there's just no room for that kind of nuance in our current system.
I think in contrast to the other authors up here, you did a kind of reporting unique in that you went undercover and went and actually worked in a strip club. In what ways did that experience inform or maybe even change your views of your own subject and how you're going about writing the book?
Sure. I mean, it's an experience I'm still processing, and I haven't quite figured out how to unpack that. But I guess I was just struck by how, I'm still processing it. But I guess like one thing I learned is that it's, you can have this sort of like public facing version of yourself that has good politics and you're coherent and all of that. But then I think sex is this odd place where things become incoherent, and I was just so forced to be in my body in a way that I think I often, I find ways of avoiding that by over-intellectualizing or through discourse or whatever. But in the end, I was like a woman of color and, working. And those facts are just inescapable in a country that hates women of color who are poor.
Jane, your book obviously is, the subject happened a long time ago. It's historical, but it's impossible not to think about it in terms of contemporary parallels. Do you see any kind of connection between the massacre in Katyn and the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, or between Stalin and Putin?
I think there are inevitable parallels. I'm reluctant to draw them too directly. But I think there are certain things that you can see. There's a very distinct continuum in the methodology of the manipulation of information, the use of outright lies, the creation of false narratives that starts with the NKVD, continues with the KGB, and with the FSB. They're part of a continuum, and Putin was trained in the KGB. He was a KGB colonel, and the mentality behind that is incredibly, strikingly similar. Often when people have asked me about, why should we care about the Katyn massacre, which in the general context of the appalling brutality of the 20th century, numerically is small. You were talking about 22,000 victims. Why should we care about it more than all the other hideous crimes, and particularly the crimes that Stalin perpetrated against his own people, of which there were millions and millions and millions. And one of the things that is most worth considering about Katyn is this long perpetuated lie. Over 4 decades, a false narrative was maintained, complete with fake history books, fake monuments, pursuit of witnesses, erasure of truth, intimidation, so many things that just do strike a chord now. And in some ways, you'd say that when you look at, for example, the case of Alexei Navalny recently, that actually the methods of the FSB have become slightly less effective because they are easier to uncover now. And then just in terms of the things that we're hearing, I mean, this is live news at the moment. These are things that have not yet had time to be fully evidenced and processed, but it seems that we are hearing levels of brutality and things which we had hoped belonged to the past. And I said to somebody earlier that one of the reflections that I have had since, I found it very difficult since the invasion. I've thought about it a lot. I'm not sure I could have written this book now, because I think in order to write, lots of people will ask me, why are you writing a book about a massacre? Surely, this sounds so depressing. Why are you focused on this? And for me, as I said earlier, it was always about a kind of act of resurrection, of bearing witness, and honouring the people who spent so long trying to uncover the truth. But part of my ability to write about it was predicated on the fact that for me it was, at least to some extent, safely in the past. And it just doesn't seem that way now.
Well, having successfully finished the book, I wonder if I could ask you one last question, and it's really a question on behalf of May and Roxana. This is for both of you. If you had to give advice to these two authors who are working to complete their books, what would you say? What was most helpful for you in keeping you going on your respective projects, and what would maybe your post-publication self say to the person who is knee-deep in the project?
Okay, a couple of quick things. First of all, trust in the process. So that is just about knowing that you know where your book is going better than anyone else. And this leads to the other thing that I wish I had learned early on, which I think is especially relevant to someone who's midstream. When you're midstream, you are vulnerable, I think, more than at the beginning of a book when it's exciting and it's new, or at the end when you know you're reaching the finish line. In the middle, you're vulnerable, I think, to the perceptions of others. That what are they thinking? The question, the dreaded question you get if you actually go out. There was a probably 2-year stretch where I didn't even go out, but where you're at a dinner party and the words come out, so how's your book? And you just don't even let them finish that question, because it leads to doubts that are very, very corrosive to the process. And I think what you really want is to never make major reporting or editing decisions from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength. That means you're well rested. That means that you feel like you just won a grant and you know what you're doing, versus you're desperately trying to figure out how to pay the rent. So those are all hard, advice to follow. But I would tell that to myself again next time around.
And Jane?
I'm sitting here racking my brains. I have no idea. Largely because I think the process, once you're in the process, to me that's relatively easier than starting the process and completing it. I think for me, the focus is always about the writing, and I'm endlessly chipping away at it, reworking it, and I suppose there comes a point where you just have to stop. And hand it over to somebody and let them look at it and let it go, I suppose, is that thing. There is also that thing about the inability to talk about projects to people outside of it. It's incredibly difficult to talk about something when you're in the middle of it, and trying to find a short... This is a very practical piece of advice. It's not a kind of existential one. A very short version of your story that when people go, what are you working on? You can say without driving them insane with boredom, because I I have been known to do that before, particularly when you're very obsessed with something and you can't encapsulate it in a couple of sentences. It's the kind of elevator pitch, to use a filmmaking sort of thing. I did once bump into a neighbour who we were getting on the same bus home, and she was very sweet and she seemed genuinely interested, and sort of always a mistake to ask me what I was writing about, and I was still talking when we got off the bus, and she got off with me, and she was looking at me, and I'm going, and I'm halfway through the story of Stalin and these very serious things. This poor woman. It's like, very nice to bump into you. So,
Well, May and Roxana, you did a very good job of not,
ready,
not doing that. Practice for fresh air, being able to talk about your book.
I don't know if
at
that
this
makes
early
any
stage.
sense.
I could ask all of you so many more questions about the content of your books, about the process of writing them, but I want to give our audience a chance to ask questions. So there's a microphone right there in the middle. If anyone has questions for our 4 authors, please feel free.
We've exhausted you.
And our Zoom audience can also send in questions, right? So any questions that come in that way.
Hi, thank you. And congratulations, all of you. And thank you, Pamela. This has been a great conversation. I had a question about navigating your publishing deal. Any advice you would have for someone who was interested in having one, or lessons learned in terms of how did you get one, getting an agent, for any of our students who might be interested in possibly writing a book? Just a few bits of advice on that would be great. Thank you.
Maybe the more recent deal makers should speak first. I don't know. You want to go, Roxana?
Sure. As far as advice goes to people who would like to get a deal, I think I really was flying blind for a good portion of it until I found my agent, Mackenzie, and she helped me a lot with my book proposal. I think I wrote several stories ahead of my book proposal, and that was really helpful because I did a lot of reporting beforehand, but B, I also I realized that it was all one thing in my brain, and that helped me a lot. I think in pitching the book, I do think like your agent is super important in the process, and so the query process, and also just in my experience, doing a lot of reporting on the front end made getting the deal easier, and also made writing the book easier because I really did have a sense of where I was going with it when I sold it.
May?
What Roxana said. I was going to say the most important thing is getting a good agent, and my amazing agent is here, but that feels a bit like a tautology. Like, obviously you need it, then how do you get a good agent? You do good work. And so there's that trick. But writing a few pieces just to see if you even like it is, I think, a good thing to do, just to test it out. And I think just having conviction that it's a good story, then in some ways the like external validation of like having an agent, selling the book, like that stuff doesn't matter as much. I think when you're younger, like that stuff is really important, and it does help you obviously, but if it's really good, like someone's gonna buy it at some point. And so just trusting in the process and knowing that it's gonna come together, that feels important.
I agree with that, and I would just add, I don't think a book is something you back into. I think it's something that you must write. That's what makes it the right project. And having a great agent, as I am so blessed to have with Tina Bennett, is not just about having a brilliant business person to help kind of get you the best deal. It's about early on creating a community around your book, which consists of you, your agent, your editor, hopefully, and maybe a couple of very, very key readers who will lift the work, basically, from its inception to its final stage, that will help shepherd it through. And that was absolutely essential to my editor, Kate Medina. I mean, these were people who for years were kind of holding the lantern for me when otherwise the field would have been just completely dark. Like, you're going to make it, you're going to make it. So I think, but also just knowing that I had to write, I couldn't not write this book. And I think that that's an important place to start from, especially if you're coming out of J school. Hopefully you will have taken Sam Friedman's class. So you have some, you have a lot of ballast there if you have. But there is just an enthusiasm that is extremely important to the process if you know you must write the book. I think that makes up for lack of experience potentially.
Yes, I think you have to be very prepared. I think it's really important to understand that a project that you commit to for a book, it has to be something that you are prepared to live with for several years, because even if you think it's going to be a short thing, it isn't. It's a long-term relationship, and you have to be so passionate about it you can't not do it. And also, the art of non-fiction writing is persuading people to be interested in something they didn't know they were going to be interested in. And, so you have to be able to carry that. I can't speak to the American process, I dare say it's fairly similar, but I was in the process of changing an agent, and I deliberately approached an agent who had a background as a non-fiction editor. And I found that so helpful along the way, because he gave so much to helping put the proposal together. He helped in editing, and it's just very useful to have another person that you can bounce ideas off, that you trust. Yeah.
Other questions from our audience?
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a student and a fellow with the Prizes Department. Thank you all for being here. I have a question about the reporting process and how you build your confidence and maintain your confidence throughout your reporting and writing that you are the right person to be tackling whatever subject or story it is, specifically when you're reporting and writing about a community that you yourself do not belong to. I did not.
I'll just jump in and say yes, because, right, it is very on point with your column. First of all, I always assume I'm the wrong person to write about anything. I think our job as journalists is to be very, very both driven and ambitious, and at the same time insecure about our lack of knowledge. We are there as students. We're there to learn. And that's the thing that I love the most about this job, is that I get to learn about all of these other worlds. I've been asked before, what right do I have to tell Dasani's story? And what I would say is that I don't see it as my right, I see it as my duty. It is my duty as a journalist to show up for the most important stories of my time, and I think this is one of them, what her story represents, and every journalist of every background should be trying to understand these issues, delving into them in some manner. And of course we bring blind spots, but it is not our job to stay in our own sort of demographic or other cultural labels lane. Like, just to stay in my lane means that I would only be able to write about other women like me in their 40s from the East Coast who have one immigrant parent and one American. I mean, it would be a very limited subject. So I think, it's in our DNA. A lot of us got into this because we're curious. We like to cross into other lanes and go into other territories to be surprised by the unknown and to encounter it, and to and in encountering it, to also be met with the reflection of our own shortcomings and potentially, our own blind spots. And I think that it's also about just being very, very open with the people you're writing about, having it be a conversation, talking about these things with them, which I have for many years with Dasani and her family. It was front and center to our process to talk about our differences and also what we had in common.
I want to say that I think it's really good to question whether you're the right person to tell the story. I think that's a good part of the process. I think if you don't, then you do have, I think your blind spots are maybe more obvious to others. So it's good for you to say, you know, why me? I definitely did a lot throughout the process. And I think, you know, part of it was I was making relationships with my sources, and those relationships were deepening, and that was feeling, I was feeling that their stories were not being told in the way that they should be told. In my case, the story itself was big national news, and so I felt like, well, here I am in this place where I have the ability to tell their story, and no one is telling that, you know. But I also think like having that kind of back and forth with yourself is an exercise in kind of interrogating your own blind spots, where you come from, what your perspective is, and that's all really important to the work as a whole.
Either of you have thoughts?
I don't think we're going to settle the debate of identity politics today, but so, you know, because my book is about sex work, obviously it's like a long meditation on consent, really. And as you mentioned, I mean, Roxana mentioned, what's really important is like getting active consent from your subjects. But as well, I guess something that I've been thinking about is, and I apologize, I won't be able to remember the third thing, but, you know, Aristotle talks about like 3 ways of making an argument. It's like logos, pathos, and then what's the other one? Sorry? Yes, you're very smart. So it's not just about lived experience is very important. As well, what's equally important is like doing the work, doing the hard work, doing all the research, and making a very persuasive argument. And when I think about the book as a project, beyond my Scrivener file, like that's what I'm thinking about. Being able to do all those 3 things. And I think similar to what you'd mentioned as well, like it's a duty, and I think actually maybe more so for me, I think about it as a real privilege. I'm contributing something to this community who's given me this like tremendous honor of letting me into people's lives, and I think if you lead with like gratitude and curiosity, that's a good thing.
I'm not a journalist, so I'm not sure I can comment on it particularly. So, yeah, I'm probably...
Well, we are actually out of time. So I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to talk to you about your books, and everyone else here on the board and the judges, and to urge all of you, especially the students who are here or watching, to read these books and to follow these 4 great writers' work. So thank you all.
Thank you.